Live from the Stability and Trim for the Ship's Officers podcast studio, where the vessel's its own best instrument of stability and trim. Welcome. This is William George. Hello, this is Bill George. We are at podcast number 24, which is chapter 11, and we're going to talk about loading computers and approved stability booklets. And basically this chapter talks about the evolution of the loading computer. When I first went to sea, we didn't have a loading computer. We had a free business machine that could do long division and multiplication. But it was a mechanical device, and it had to be oiled, and it was run by an electric motor. It could do repetitive additions, and it could do repetitive subtractions, and it worked, but it was a different world back then. So as we go through this, there's in the chapter we talk about from page 255 through pages 60, 61, 62, even page 63 and page 64 and 65. These are examples of from the beginning, we could say, up to around 1985. And these computers are historic, and they should be in the Smithsonian. And they just show you that these were mechanical devices that were used to calculate trim and stability. Sadly, they couldn't really calculate hull stress. But it's kind of interesting reading if you want the historical version of these. But I don't think you'll be seeing anything like these anymore. So we go to page 261, and there's a need for the new loading computers. Now, prior to World War II, the average deadweight of a merchant vessel was about 10,000 tons. During post-World War II, the demand for basic raw materials had a direct impact on shipping policies around the world, and according to the size of ships grew, by 1958 we had giant tankers for back then that were 25,000 tons dead weight, where bending moments could easily approach and even reach dangerous magnitudes, whereupon the oceans of the world. Using these ships to their fullest without excessive stress or risk-taking demanded more precise calculations than mechanical analog computers in World War II. So the mechanical analog computers are what the first pages of this chapter talk about, basically from page 255 to 261. Trim and stability booklets in the 1950s started to include curves and diagrams to check bending moments amidships by longitudinal calculations. Remember, not until the mid-1960s, electronic calculator was the first available to the public. As a result, quicker turnaround, and I think it was 1964 when Texas Instrument came out with a calculator that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide for the common man or student. That was affordable, and back then they were a princely sum of at least $100 a piece. Now you could buy the same calculator for about $2 and change on a keychain. As a result, the quicker turnaround times for these larger tankers, the masters having attended various duties, had little or no time left for their disposal to perform such calculations. It was during this time that the first mechanical longitudinal strength and trim and analog computers began to appear. Using one of these mechanical type computers, the ship's officers could select a compartment by inserting a knob in a corresponding notch, loading input, and then by turning the wheel. The procedure was to repeat until for all the other compartments. This caused a color diagram mounted in a cylinder to rotate, showing instantaneously the deadweight, draft, and trim and bending moments midships. As an example of this type of device, it was a mechanical loadmaster manufactured in Sweden by Kockumation, if I pronounced that correctly. By the time the size of the tankers grew from giant to mammoth, the range was 28,000 to 45,000 tons dead weight. The value of shear force acting on a ship grew drastically, and the maximum bending moment could occur at other places than amidships. At this point, mechanical loading computers became obsolete. Aside from the value of maximum bending moment, the location must also be found. These new computing requirements, along with improvements in technology, led to the development of an electronic multi-point analog trim and longitudinal hull strength computer. The loadicator is shown on Figure 11-6 as an example of this type of computer. And these were, again, computers that resembled more of something out of a science fiction movie than anything else. They had a lot of dials, some meters, and basically they were dedicated computers. You couldn't reprogram these. You could only do one thing that they were designed to do. They were not like a personal computer of today. So if we get to 1985, now we're about page 266 in the book. The subtitle is 1985 to 1995, Personal Computers Going to Sea. Before there was the internet, there was personal computers. In 1985, the personal computer might have a processing speed of 10 kilohertz and a memory of 16 kilobytes. This edition of this book is being written in 2004, and the computer having a speed of 3.2 megahertz and a memory of 200 gigabytes. In 1985, even though the personal computer was available, the spreadsheet had not yet been invented. Programs were made in various compiler languages and were difficult to learn as well as program. However, as small as these computers were, they could do the job. A typical early personal computer shown in Figure 11-9, the keyboard, screen, and printer were all in one desktop case. The computer was the vessel's property, and the software was preloaded into it and was dedicated just to do the one job: stability, trim, and hull strength calculations. This type of computer was an improvement over the older, larger, more cumbersome devices that were basically analog or electro-analog devices. However, it was not a desktop or laptop computer of today. When using these early computers, all readings were simultaneously displayed. Operation personnel had an overview of the effect of alterations in the loading pattern and could see the points where overstresses could quickly take measures to obtain the maximum payload with a minimum stress, desired trim, and adequate GM. It was normal practice for these computers to indicate drafts at the forward and after perpendiculars because the perpendiculars are the critical points for touching ground. However, the draft marks on the ship aren't necessarily at the perpendiculars. Near zero, the readings were practically identical to those of the ship's draft marks. It should be realized that when the ship has considerable trim by the bow or stern, the drafts reading at the marks do not agree with the calculated computer drafts at the forward and after perpendiculars. Also, the user should investigate to see if the drafts are corrected to the harbor water density or at seawater. Typical ship's officer now usually has more than one computer. As you can see from Figure 11-10, there's usually a ship's loading computer in an off-the-shelf personal computer loaded with the approved software and required stability, trim, and hull strength calculations. However, it is very common to find the chief mate's personal laptop right beside the ship's computer. Typically, the ship's chief mate's personal computer is his personal property and is newer and more up-to-date machine than what the ship owns. Remember, the ship's desktop computer was installed when the ship was constructed and was completed. There was no concern to update this machine due to the dedicated nature of its approved software. So basically, the approved software in the ship's loading computer has to perform the same way as and give you the same answers as the ship's approved stability booklet. It's not really the greatest idea to say that you'd rather make your own stability and loading computer, because you are supposed to use the approved loading manual and the approved loading computer, and that usually the class is the person agency that approves these. The question now arises, why have two computers? Well, for certain trades, vessels' chief officers needs to do calculations other than stability and trim and hull strength. One example is a draft survey calculation to determine the amount of cargo loaded or discharged. Another example is navigation applications. Since very powerful laptop computers are now available and relatively cheap, almost all chief officers and vessel masters have their own computers, similar to the way people used to go to sea with their own sextants. Since this is a very powerful laptop, since these professionals have spent many hours at sea developing custom spreadsheet calculations, they can look even better and more professional than the printouts on the ship's approved loading computer. The trouble is that because the computers are getting cheaper and more powerful every year, these professionals trade up to better computers and sell their old computers with their programs and spreadsheets to the junior officers who move on to another vessel. The applications made by the original owner may work just fine for the navigation, but are not suitable for different vessels for the use of the loading computer software that they might have developed. As stated in the beginning of this chapter, no device or booklet can relieve the ship's officer from the responsibility of a thorough knowledge of the fundamentals of stability, trim, and longitudinal hull strength. A word of caution: while the personal computer can save time and effort, the user must confirm the software that is being used actually does produce answers that are just as reliable and complete as the vessel's approved loading computer and loading manual or trim and stability booklet. It is the author's personal experience as a marine cargo surveyor that it is better to do basic calculations with a pocket calculator and double check them on board with a vessel than use a laptop on the vessel with no separate procedure to double check the calculations. Why? The answer is simple. The laptop can be too distracting. Everyone wants to see how the state-of-the-art the laptop computer is rather than check the answer to produces are accurate. Many ship's officers have been warned that the computer is like anyone who you are attracted to. You want to believe everything that they tell you is true. Remember the old adage, garbage in and garbage out. Be careful when dealing with computers, especially with ones you're not familiar with. 1995 to 2000, the age of the internet and cellular phones. The World Wide Web grew rapidly between 1995 and the year 2000. Such developments in technology brought on new ways of doing business for everyone. One advent was the container ships with the development of planning hubs away from port areas. At Seattle, Washington, container loading plans for stability, trim, and list and hull strength are planned at such central locations as Salt Lake City, Utah, Boise, Idaho, Houston, Texas, or even outside the continental United States, depending on the steamship line. It is not uncommon for the same vessel planner to work with the same chief mate for a complete coastwise discharge and loading. Telephones provide the voice communication via speakerphone, and the internet provides the computer connection for the vessel planners and the terminals. Wireless cellular phones and internet connections link the ships as the to the planners as well. 2000 in the future, wireless and the internet. As the wireless technology grows, more and more technology will be connected real time. The ship's officer will be responsible for final approval of the proposed loading. Most likely, the officer will be asked to approve a loading plan prior to the vessel arriving at the berth. There was one instance when a container ship had just secured starboard side to the terminal, and the proposed loading was presented to the ship's chief officer. He immediately refused to accept the stowage because it was apparent to him that he could not take any more ballast as required on one side of his ship. It was then realized that the ship had been planned for the